The corridor was quiet in the wrong way. No footsteps. No voices. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights and a dropped metal tray still spinning slowly on the floor. At the far end of the ward, a young clerk stood behind a reception desk, sleeves rolled, eyes lowered to a stack of patient files. No one looked at him twice. No one ever did. Then the first shout came, sharp, panicked, cut short. A second later, the hospital doors slammed open. Men rushed in. Not patients. Not police. Something worse. Nurses froze. A doctor backed into the wall. Someone reached for a phone, but the lines were already dead. The clerk didn't move. Not yet. He just listened. Measured the distance. Counted the voices. And when the radio on the abandoned security desk crackled to life, spitting fragments of confused orders, he looked up for the first time. They thought he was just a clerk. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The evening shift settled in without ceremony. Monitors beeped in steady rhythm. Trolleys rolled past with practiced urgency. Voices stayed low, controlled, shaped by routine more than emotion. It was the kind of order that only existed because everyone believed it would hold. At the center of it, behind a narrow reception desk at the edge of the ward, sat the clerk. He wore the same pale uniform as the rest of the administrative staff. Sleeves rolled just enough to keep them from brushing the paperwork. A pen rested neatly beside his right hand. Files were stacked in precise alignment, corners squared, labels facing outward. He did not rush. He did not linger. Every movement had a measured pace, as if time itself was something to be managed, not chased. "File for bed 12, a nurse said without looking at him, already moving past. He slid the correct folder forward before she finished the sentence. She took it without slowing down. No acknowledgement. No pause. The clerk returned his hand to the desk. Across the ward, a junior doctor struggled with a chart, flipping pages too quickly, missing what he needed. The clerk watched for a moment, not staring, just observing, then quietly reached under the desk, pulled a duplicate record, and placed it on the counter's edge. The doctor noticed it seconds later. "Finally," he muttered, grabbing it, never checking who had placed it there. The clerk lowered his eyes again. Invisible efficiency. It was a role people accepted without thinking. Systems worked, so no one asked how. Tasks were completed, so no one asked by whom. Above him, a wall clock ticked in clean, mechanical intervals. 1842. He adjusted a file slightly, less than a centimeter, aligning it with the edge of the desk. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like habit. It was not. A stretcher rolled in from the corridor. The patient was conscious but disoriented, breathing uneven. Two nurses guided the movement, one speaking softly, the other checking vitals. "Room 7, one of them said. The clerk's eyes lifted briefly. Room 7 had been reassigned 10 minutes earlier. "Room 9, he corrected, voice calm, almost quiet enough to miss. The nurse frowned, ready to argue, then checked her notes. A pause. "Right," she said, adjusting direction. No apology. No surprise. Just correction accepted. Explanation unnecessary. The clerk watched the stretcher disappear down the hall. His gaze lingered a fraction longer than required, not on the patient, but on the path they took. Counting doors. Measuring distance. Then he looked back down. A security guard passed the desk, slower than usual. His uniform was slightly out of place, collar misaligned, radio clipped too low on his belt. The clerk's eyes registered the details without expression. "Quiet night," the guard said casually. The clerk gave a small nod. "Quiet," he repeated. The guard moved on. The word hung in the air for a moment. Quiet. Not calm. Not safe. Just quiet. At the far end of the ward, a phone rang once, then stopped abruptly. The clerk's pen paused above the paper. He waited. No second ring. No follow-up. His pen moved again, continuing the line he had been writing, but slower now. More deliberate. A nurse approached the desk, placing a clipboard down with a soft tap. "Systems lagging again," she said. "Admissions are delayed." He glanced at the screen beside him. The interface flickered, subtle, but irregular. Not a full outage. Not a complete failure. Just enough to slow things down. Noted, he said. She sighed, already turning away. IT will fix it eventually. He did not respond. Instead, he reached under the desk again and adjusted a cable connection, just slightly, just enough to stabilize the signal. The screen steadied. Temporary, but sufficient. He did not announce it. Did not call her back. The system would appear to correct itself. That was preferable. Another stretcher passed. This one empty. Moving faster than necessary. The clerk's eyes followed it. No patient. No explanation. The rhythm of the ward shifted, subtle, almost unnoticeable unless someone was looking for it. He was. A faint metallic sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. Not loud. Not sharp. Just out of place. His hand stilled again. He listened. Nothing followed. Around him, the ward continued as if nothing had changed. Charts were updated. Patients were checked. Conversations resumed. Normal. He reached for the pen again, but did not write. Instead, he adjusted the position of the radio resting on the unattended security desk nearby. It was angled away, volume low, half forgotten. He turned it slightly. Just enough to hear. Static. Then silence. His gaze returned to the files in front of him, but his attention had shifted elsewhere entirely. Tracking. Listening. Waiting. The clock ticked forward. 1847. No one noticed the change. No one noticed him. And for now, he allowed that to continue. The ward continued to function. On the surface, nothing had changed. A patient called for water. A nurse responded. A monitor alarmed briefly, then was silenced. The steady rhythm of the hospital carried on, supported by routine and expectation. But beneath it, something had shifted. Not enough to stop the system. Just enough to strain it. Behind the desk, the clerk adjusted the position of a patient log, aligning it with the edge. His movements remained unhurried, precise. His attention did not. The radio gave a faint crackle. He did not reach for it immediately. He let it speak first. Static. Then a clipped voice, too brief to form words. Then silence again. He noted the timing. Irregular. Not random. Across the ward, a nurse approached quickly, her pace tighter than before. 2 incoming from the west entrance, she said, placing a form down. But no ambulance tag yet. The clerk glanced at the form. No identification code. No dispatch reference. He looked up. Who called it in? He asked. She hesitated. Reception said it came through Central. Central always tagged their calls. Always. He nodded once and slid the form into a separate stack, not with admissions, not with errors. A third category. Unspoken. The nurse noticed the movement but said nothing. She was already turning back, drawn by another call. The clerk's gaze followed her path. Not the person. The route. Counting again. Distances. Time to reach each point. The radio crackled once more, longer this time. Repeat. Unit delayed. Hold. Then it cut. No confirmation. No closure. He leaned back slightly in his chair, just enough to shift his angle toward the security desk without making it obvious. His eyes settled on the radio. Still. Waiting. A stretcher entered from the west corridor. Faster than standard intake. The patient was covered, face partially obscured, movement controlled but rushed. "Where's the receiving team?" one of the orderlies asked, breath-tight. "They were notified," another replied. They weren't. The clerk had seen no record. He stood. It was a small movement, almost incidental, as if stretching after sitting too long. But it gave him a clearer line of sight. The patient's arm slipped slightly from the covering. No hospital band. No field tag. No marking at all. Room assignment? The orderly called toward the desk. The clerk answered immediately. "Hold position," he said. The words were calm. Neutral. But they landed differently. The orderly paused, just for a second. "Why?" he asked. The clerk stepped closer, picking up a clipboard as if checking details. "Receiving room is being cleared," he said. 30 seconds. It was not true. But it created space. The orderly hesitated again, then nodded. 30 seconds. The stretcher stopped. 30 seconds of stillness in a place that did not allow it. The clerk used them. His eyes moved quickly, patient, clothing, hands, breathing pattern. No visible trauma. No standard intake signs. Controlled stillness. Too controlled. Proceed to room 9, he said at exactly 30 seconds. The orderly moved without question. The moment passed. Routine resumed. But not fully. The clerk returned to his desk, sitting down with the same measured motion. He picked up his pen, continued writing as if nothing had interrupted him. Across the ward, the earlier nurse returned, slower this time. "Systems down again," she said quietly. "Admissions aren't syncing at all now." He glanced at the screen. The flicker was gone. Now it was blank. Not frozen. Disconnected. "Switch to manual logs," he said. She frowned slightly. "That'll slow everything." "It will keep it accurate," he replied. A pause. Then she nodded. "All right." She moved off, already adjusting her workflow. No argument. No escalation. Just adaptation. The clerk placed the pen down and opened a drawer beneath the desk. Inside, rows of forms were stacked with careful order, backup systems for when digital ones failed. He took out a set and placed them neatly on the counter. Prepared. Not reactive. The radio crackled again, louder this time. "Any unit respond, status unknown, west side unsecured." A different voice cut in, overlapping. "Negative confirmation, repeat, negative." Then silence. Not static. Silence. The kind that followed interruption. The clerk's hand rested on the edge of the desk. Still. He did not reach for the radio. Not yet. Across the ward, the security guard from earlier reappeared, moving faster now. His radio was in his hand, volume turned up. "You hearing this?" he asked, voice low but tense. The clerk looked at him briefly. "I am," he said. "What is it?" the guard pressed. The clerk held his gaze for a moment. "Unclear," he answered. "It was the truth. But not the whole of it." The guard exhaled, running a hand over his head. "Feels wrong," he muttered. The clerk said nothing. "Because that, too, was true." A distant sound echoed from the entrance. Not loud, not sharp, but final. Like a door forced open and not meant to close again. Several heads turned. Then looked away. No one moved toward it. No one moved away. The system hesitated. The clerk did not. He reached out and adjusted the radio volume one level higher. Just enough. Then he returned his hand to the desk. Waiting. Listening. Counting. The clock ticked forward. 18:52. The ward was still functioning. But now, it was holding its breath. The sound came again. Closer this time. Not loud enough to trigger alarms, but wrong enough to be felt. A hard impact. Metal against metal. Then a brief echo through the corridor that didn't belong to anything routine. At the desk, the clerk did not look up immediately. He listened. Measured the spacing between sounds. One step. Through. A pause. Then movement again. Not the rhythm of hospital staff. Across the ward, a nurse slowed mid-step, her hand still resting on a patient's chart. She turned slightly toward the entrance corridor, unsure why. "Did you hear?" The words didn't finish. The doors at the far end opened. Not fully. Just enough to let something through. A man stepped inside. He wasn't dressed like a patient. No visible injury. No hesitation in his movement. His eyes scanned the room once, quick, efficient, before he moved to the side, clearing space. Two more followed. Then a fourth. They entered in silence. No shouting. No immediate aggression. But they did not belong. The shift in the room was immediate, even if no one could explain it. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A trolley wheel squeaked once, then stilled. A monitor beeped into the quiet, suddenly too loud. The clerk lifted his gaze. For the first time since the shift began, he did not lower it again. He watched them. 4 men. Positioning deliberate. Spacing consistent. Not random. The first moved toward the central corridor. The second lingered near the entrance. The others drifted wider, creating coverage without drawing attention. Containment. Not chaos. That was worse. A doctor stepped forward, uncertain but trying to assert control. "This is a restricted area," he said, voice steady but thin. "You can't." One of the men raised a hand. Not a threat. Just a signal. The doctor stopped speaking. The silence deepened. At the desk, the clerk's eyes shifted, not to the men, but to their hands. Empty. But ready. One of them reached into his jacket, not quickly, not dramatically, and withdrew a compact device. Not a weapon. A signal jammer. The clerk recognized the shape immediately. Within seconds, the remaining monitors on the network flickered. Then went dark. Not all at once. One by one. Systematic. The nurse at the far station tapped her screen. "It's down," she said, confusion rising. "Everything's down." No response came from IT. No internal alert. Just absence. The man near the entrance adjusted his position slightly, angling himself to watch both the corridor and the main exit. Blocking. Not overtly, but effectively. The clerk's hand moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the edge of the desk. He did not reach for anything. He simply adjusted his posture. Feet flat. Chair angled. Line of sight clear. Across the ward, the earlier stretcher, room 9, remained behind a partially closed curtain. Unattended. Unverified. The clerk's gaze lingered there for half a second. Then returned. One of the intruders began walking toward the center of the ward. Not rushing. Not hesitating. Each step placed with intention. A nurse stepped back instinctively, her shoulder brushing against a supply cart. The metal rattled softly. The man didn't react. But another did. A subtle shift. A glance. Coordination without words. The clerk tracked it all. Movement. Spacing. Focus. He counted again. 4 visible. No immediate sign of more. But the entry had been too controlled for only 4. A 5th would be outside. Or waiting. The radio on the security desk crackled suddenly, loud in the silence. "Any internal unit respond. West entrance compromised. Repeat, compromised." One of the men turned toward the sound instantly. Too fast. Too precise. He moved toward the desk. The clerk's hand lifted the radio before the man reached it. Not quickly. Not defensively. Just enough to seem routine. He turned the volume down. The voice became a murmur. The man stopped a few steps away. Their eyes met. For a moment, the room narrowed to that single line of sight. The clerk's expression did not change. Neutral. Unremarkable. A worker managing equipment. Nothing more. The man studied him. Not long. Just enough. Then he looked away. Dismissed. The clerk placed the radio back on the desk. Exactly where it had been. The moment passed. But the calculation remained. Across the ward, the doctor who had spoken earlier stepped back fully now, hands raised slightly, not in surrender, but in uncertainty. "What do you want?" he asked. No answer came. Not yet. Because this was not about demands. Not immediately. This was positioning. Control before communication. The clerk's gaze moved once more across the room. Exits. Obstructions. People. He noted who was frozen. Who was moving. Who might panic. Then he looked at the clock. 18:55. 3 minutes since the first sound. The situation had already shifted beyond recovery. But not beyond control. Not yet. He lowered his eyes again, just slightly, returning to the role. Waiting. Because the next move would define everything. No one gave an order. That was the first sign. The men had taken positions. They had silenced the systems. They controlled the space without raising their voices. But still, no demands, no instructions, no escalation. They were waiting. For something. Or someone. In that absence, the ward began to fracture. Not loudly. Not all at once. But in small, human ways. A nurse at the far end tried to guide a patient toward a side room, her voice too soft to carry. Another staff member reached for a phone out of instinct, then froze halfway when nothing responded. A junior doctor stepped back too quickly and knocked into a tray, the sharp clatter cutting through the silence. One of the intruders turned toward the sound. Not aggressively, but directly. The doctor stopped moving. Hands raised slightly now. Still no words. At the desk, the clerk watched the pattern form. Control through pressure. No overt force. Just enough presence to compress the room. Near the center of the ward, a nurse moved, faster than the others. She wasn't panicking, but she wasn't still either. Her path angled toward the medication station, cutting across open space. Too exposed. The clerk saw it before anyone else. One of the men shifted his stance. Adjusted angle. Intercept trajectory. Not rushed. Inevitable. The clerk stood. Again, the movement was small. Measured. Easy to overlook unless someone was already watching him. No one was. He stepped away from the desk, picking up a clipboard as he moved. His pace matched the ward's rhythm, neither fast nor slow. Normal. He crossed into the open. The nurse continued forward, unaware of the line she was about to cross. The intruder moved. Just a step. But it was enough. The clerk altered his path slightly, closing the distance from a different angle. He reached the medication station just ahead of her, placing the clipboard down with a soft but deliberate tap. "Stock count is off," he said quietly, not looking at her directly. "Check it." The nurse slowed instinctively. "What?" "Now," he said, still calm. The word landed differently. Not louder, but firmer. She hesitated, just long enough to break her trajectory. Then she turned toward the station. Away from the open path. Away from the intercept. The intruder stopped moving. The moment dissolved before it formed. No confrontation. No escalation. Just absence. The clerk began to turn away, as if the interaction had been routine, insignificant. "Wait," the nurse said softly, confusion in her voice. "What?" He didn't answer. He had already moved on. Returning to the desk. The clipboard remained behind. A reason for her to stay. A reason not to move. Across the ward, one of the men watched the exchange. Not the words. The timing. The positioning. He held his gaze on the clerk for a second longer than the others had. Not suspicion. Not yet. But awareness. The clerk resumed his place behind the desk, adjusting a stack of forms as if nothing had happened. His hands were steady. His breathing unchanged. Only his eyes moved. Tracking. Reassessing. The nurse at the station flipped through the inventory sheets, still unsettled. "There's nothing wrong here," she murmured to herself. But she didn't leave. Not immediately. Time had been created. That was enough. Near the entrance, another intruder shifted position, glancing briefly toward the corridor behind him. His hand brushed the inside of his jacket, not drawing anything, just confirming presence. A signal. To someone not yet visible. The clerk noted it. Fifth position confirmed. Not inside. Not yet. The radio crackled again. "Units are staging, need internal confirmation, anyone respond." The voice was sharper now. More urgent. Still blind. The clerk did not reach for it. Not this time. Too early. Across the ward, the earlier patient in room 9 stirred behind the curtain. A faint movement. A shift of fabric. One of the intruders turned his head slightly in that direction. Attention divided. Briefly. The clerk saw the opening. But did not act. Not yet. Because acting now would reveal too much. Instead, he lowered his gaze again, picking up his pen, writing a line across a form that did not need writing. Maintaining the shape of normal. Maintaining invisibility. A doctor moved closer to the desk, slower now, cautious. "What do we do?" he asked under his breath. The clerk didn't look up. "Continue," he said. The doctor stared at him. Continue what? The clerk's pen stopped. He looked up then, just briefly. Your work, he said. Nothing more. The doctor hesitated, then nodded, because there was nothing else to hold on to. Across the room, the men remained in place, watching, waiting. The ward was no longer theirs. But it was not lost either. It was suspended, balanced between action and restraint. And at the center of it, the clerk sat quietly, already shaping what would come next. Without being seen, the silence changed shape. It was no longer empty. It was monitored, measured, held in place by people who understood how silence could be used as pressure. The clerk felt it in the spacing between movements, in the way no one spoke too loudly, in the way even footsteps softened instinctively, as if the floor itself had become sensitive. At the security desk, the radio crackled again, longer this time. Not a fragment. A channel trying to stabilize. This is response coordination. Internal units report compromised West Corridor. Need visual confirmation. Repeat, need confirmation. The voice cut in and out, as if the building itself was refusing connection. The clerk watched it without moving. Then, slowly, he reached for it. Not urgently. Not like someone responding to crisis. Like someone picking up a tool already in use. He brought it closer, turned the dial once, carefully. Static thinned. Voices layered underneath. Multiple channels bleeding into one another. Confusion. Coordination breaking apart. Outside the hospital, something large was trying to organize itself. Inside, it could not see. The clerk pressed the transmit button, but did not speak. He listened first. A pause. Then a second voice broke through. We are holding perimeter, need internal read, any friendly units inside, respond. Friendly units. The clerk's eyes flicked briefly toward the ward. No one here was a unit. Not officially. Not yet. He released the button. Silence returned. Behind him, a nurse moved cautiously between beds, checking vitals that no longer updated on screens. Her hands were steady, but slower now, as if the absence of system feedback had forced her into doubt. A doctor stood near the corridor entrance, staring at a blank monitor. We're blind, he said quietly. No one contradicted him, because it was true. The clerk adjusted the radio again. One frequency, then another. He was not searching randomly. He was narrowing, finding structure inside noise. Outside voices overlapped, requesting clearance. Hold position. Unknown armed presence inside facility. Repeat, unknown. Unknown. The clerk exhaled once, then pressed transmit. Still no identification. Only control. West Corridor is compromised, he said calmly. No name. No rank. Just fact. A pause. On the other end of the line, hesitation. Then, confirm identity. The clerk did not answer immediately. He looked up. Across the ward, one of the intruders had shifted again. Closer to the center. Still not rushing. Still contained. The system outside was trying to label what it could not see. Inside, he understood that labels were irrelevant. He pressed transmit again. Medical staff are contained. Movement restricted. West Corridor access blocked. Still no identity. Still no claim. Another pause. Then a change in tone. Lower. More controlled. Copy partial. Maintain position. Do not engage unless confirmed hostile. The clerk released the button. The radio settled into quieter static. He had not been accepted. But he had been heard. That was enough. For now. Behind him, movement tightened again. One of the intruders was watching him more closely now. Not openly, but consistently. The clerk noticed. Of course he did. He placed the radio back on the desk, turning it slightly, just enough to maintain clear reception. Then he sat down. The ward had not changed physically, but the structure inside it had shifted. Now there were two systems operating in parallel. One visible, one not. A nurse approached hesitantly. "Who are you talking to?" she asked. The clerk did not look at her immediately. When he did, his expression remained unchanged. "Coordination," he said. "That's not security protocol," she replied. A pause. He nodded slightly. "I know." That was all. She stared at him for a moment longer, searching for something to attach meaning to. Finding nothing familiar. Then she walked away. The radio crackled again. This time sharper. Closer. "We have partial internal guidance. Repeat, partial guidance, adjusting entry routes." Outside forces were now moving based on his input. Without knowing him. Without verifying him. The clerk watched the ward again. The intruders had subtly adjusted their spacing. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to see. They were reacting. Not to panic. To direction. He lowered his gaze. The pen on the desk remained untouched. The clipboard sat where he left it. Normal still existed, but only as appearance. The clerk turned the radio volume down by 1 level. Then paused. A decision forming quietly. Not yet action. Just readiness. Because now, everything inside the hospital was beginning to respond to something no one else could see. And he had not fully stepped into it. Not yet. The hospital was no longer quiet. It was restrained. Every movement felt measured now, not by routine, but by uncertainty. Staff continued their tasks, but each action carried hesitation beneath it, as if the building itself no longer fully belonged to them. The clerk remained at the desk, still, observing. The radio sat angled toward him, volume lowered, but active. Every few seconds, a fragment of the outside operation bled through. Adjusting entry route based on internal feed. Hold until confirmation. Unknown coordinator inside structure assisting movement. Unknown coordinator. He did not react. He simply listened. Across the ward, the intruders had subtly shifted again. Their formation was no longer static. It was adapting, responding to something invisible to everyone else in the room. A corridor that had been ignored was now partially blocked. A secondary entrance that had been open was now watched. A path that should have been direct was now avoided. No one inside the hospital had given those instructions. Not formally. Not visibly. But the effect was real. A nurse noticed a change in movement near the west corridor. "Why are they avoiding that wing?" she whispered. No one answered her. Because no one knew. The clerk did. He watched the spacing tighten again. Then loosen somewhere else. Like pressure being applied and released in controlled intervals. Outside forces were listening to him. And acting on fragments. He reached for the radio again. Pressed transmit. No introduction. No identity. Just control. East corridor is clearer than assumed. Reroute 2 units through secondary access point. A pause. Then. Confirm source of instruction. He did not respond immediately. His eyes moved briefly toward the ward. One of the intruders had stopped walking. Head slightly tilted. Listening. Not to the hospital. To the response. The clerk released the transmit button. Silence returned for a moment. Then. Copy. Adjusting. The system accepted it. Not because it trusted him. Because it had no alternative. Inside the ward, a stretcher was pushed toward a side room under reduced speed. Nurses moved with quieter urgency now, avoiding open spaces where possible. The clerk noted every adjustment. Every reaction. Every correction in movement caused by his words. He was no longer just observing the situation. He was shaping it. But carefully. Minimally. Never more than necessary. A voice came from behind him. "Who authorized you to speak on that channel?" The doctor from earlier. Closer now. More direct. Unsteady but trying to regain authority. The clerk did not turn fully. Only enough. "No one," he said. "That's not how this works," the doctor replied. "We need protocol. We need—" "Protocol is offline," the clerk interrupted calmly. A pause. The doctor hesitated. Because it was true. Everything official had collapsed into silence. He tried again. You're not security. The clerk finally looked at him fully. A steady gaze. No emotion. No escalation. Just clarity. I am what is available, he said. The words were not dramatic. They were functional. That made them harder to challenge. The doctor's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Nothing followed. He stepped back. Not convinced, but unable to argue against absence of alternatives. The clerk returned to the radio. Another transmission came through. Unknown internal coordinator continues to redirect movement. Effectiveness confirmed. Request identification pending. Effectiveness confirmed. That was enough. Outside, the response units were now moving with partial structure. Inside, the intruders were adjusting again. But something had changed. One of them was no longer moving with the same certainty. He was watching the hospital differently now. Not as an environment, but as a system being influenced. His gaze shifted toward the clerk's desk. Held. Longer than before. The clerk noticed. Of course he did. But he did not return the attention. Instead, he lowered his eyes slightly and wrote on a blank form. A line. Nothing meaningful. Just motion. Maintaining appearance. Maintaining invisibility. A nurse passed behind him, whispering to another staff member. It feels like someone's guiding them. The clerk did not react. But the radio did. Adjusting perimeter based on internal coordination signals. Signals. Not a person. Not yet. The system still refused to define him fully. That was safer. For everyone. A sudden movement near the far corridor drew attention. One of the intruders had repositioned. Closer now. Not rushing. Testing. The clerk tracked him. Measured distance. Angles. Timing. Still no direct confrontation. Still controlled pressure. But the balance was tightening. He reached for the radio again. Paused. Then did something different. Instead of transmitting outward, he adjusted internal frequency alignment. Subtle. Precise. A recalibration rather than a command. The effect would not be immediate, but it would redirect incoming coordination flow. Outside units would begin prioritizing incorrect assumptions. Movement would shift again. Not because he told them, because he allowed them to believe a structure that wasn't fully accurate. He released the radio, leaning back slightly, exhaling once. Small. Controlled. Across the ward, the intruders paused again. A shift in their formation. A recalculation. The clerk watched it happen. Quietly. Without expression. The system was no longer stable on either side. And now, both sides were unknowingly reacting to him. The hospital's rhythm had fully collapsed into controlled disorder. Not chaos, something more dangerous. A structured instability where every movement depended on uncertain information. The clerk remained at the center of it. Still behind the desk most of the time. But not always. Now the ward responded to his absence as much as his presence. That was new. And it had consequences. The radio carried constant fragments now. Movement corrected. Route adjusted. Internal coordination still active. Repeat, unknown operator continues guiding flow. The system outside was no longer asking if someone was inside. It was reacting as if someone was. Inside the ward, the intruders had tightened their formation again. Less exploratory now. More committed. They had recognized a pattern. Not fully understood it, but recognized its effect. And they were adapting. One of them moved faster than before. Not rushing, deciding. He broke from formation and advanced toward the central corridor. Direct line. No hesitation. A nurse stepped back too late. Her tray slipped. Metal struck tile. The sound snapped through the ward like a trigger. Everyone froze. The intruder didn't. He continued forward. The clerk saw the trajectory immediately. It was not random. It was aimed at the medical station cluster, where staff density was highest, where control would collapse fastest. The clerk stood. No delay. No hesitation. But this time, he did not move subtly. He moved into the open corridor directly. The shift was immediate. Several heads turned, including the intruders. Their eyes met for the first time without distance between interpretation and reality. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the intruder changed angle. Slightly. Not stopping. Re-evaluating. The clerk stepped into his path, not blocking aggressively, but forcing spatial adjustment. A simple repositioning. Enough to disrupt a straight line. "Stop movement through this corridor," the clerk said quietly. Not a command meant for the intruder. For the space. For the structure. The intruder did not respond verbally. But his hand shifted inside his jacket. Not fully drawing anything. Just confirming readiness. Behind them, a nurse tried to pull a patient back into a side room. The patient stumbled. Not injured, but unstable. And that instability mattered. The intruder saw it. His focus shifted for a fraction of a second. Toward vulnerability. The clerk noticed the shift. He stepped forward again, not closer to the intruder, but into the line of attention. Redirecting focus. "Medical evacuation route is clear to west side exit," he said calmly. It was not fully true, but it created movement logic. And movement logic prevented panic logic. The intruder paused. The corridor tension tightened. Then, the radio cracked sharply. "Internal coordinator confirms west side routing. Proceed." Outside had accepted it. Without verification. That changed everything. The intruder hesitated. Just long enough. Then changed direction. Not fully withdrawing, but adjusting. The clerk exhaled once. Minimal. Controlled. Behind him, a nurse moved a patient who had nearly collapsed during the moment of tension. But she moved too late. The patient hit the edge of a metal stand. A sharp impact. A small injury. Not life-threatening, but real. And visible. The clerk turned his head slightly. Saw it. A fraction of delay. That was enough. One of the intruders noticed the pause. He followed the clerk's gaze. Understood something incorrectly, but dangerously. He took a step forward. This time faster. More direct. The balance shifted. The clerk saw it immediately. This was escalation. Real escalation. He moved to intercept, not physically overpowering, but positioning between the intruder and the staff cluster. The intruder stopped. But only briefly. The space had become unstable again. And this time, the cost was visible. The injured patient was being moved, but the damage had already altered perception inside the room. Fear increased. Control weakened. The clerk reached for the radio while still standing in the corridor. Pressed transmit. West corridor movement is compromised. Reinforce medical evacuation priority. Non-essential entry suspended. A pause. Then outside. Confirm authority source. The clerk did not answer. Not this time. Instead, he looked at the intruder directly. And spoke, not into the radio, not to the system. "To everyone inside," he said quietly, "do not create additional movement." It was not a threat. It was constraint. The intruder held his position. But now there was tension in him that had not been there before. Uncertainty. The clerk returned to the desk slowly. But not everything returned with him. The injury had changed the environment. Not physically. Psychologically. A line had been crossed where control now carried visible cost. A nurse approached him briefly. "Someone is hurt because of this," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he replied. "And you're still doing it." A pause. Then, "I am reducing what comes next," he said. Not justification. Not defense. Observation. She didn't respond. Because she couldn't argue against future harm that had not yet happened. The radio continued quietly. Outside coordination had become more confident. Inside control had become more fragile. The intruders adjusted again, but slower now. More cautious. The clerk watched both systems. And understood something clearly. He was no longer redirecting a situation. He was holding it from breaking. And holding always required cost. Even when no one saw it directly. The hospital no longer felt divided between two sides. It felt compressed. Every corridor, every doorway, every paused breath carried weight, as if the entire building had narrowed into a single decision point. The clerk could feel it in the timing of movement. Slower responses. Shorter exchanges. Fewer corrections accepted without question. Control was still present, but it was no longer smooth. It was strained. The intruders had stopped expanding their positions. They were consolidating. That was the clearest sign of escalation. Not more movement. More focus. The radio, now almost constantly active, carried fragmented confirmation from outside units. Internal coordination still active. Adjusting perimeter based on live input. Unknown operator effectiveness increasing. Unknown operator. The phrase no longer felt temporary. It was becoming structure. At the center of the ward, the clerk stood behind the desk for a long moment without moving. Then he closed the folder in front of him. Slowly. Deliberately. Not as an ending. As a decision. Across the ward, one of the intruders began moving again. Not cautiously this time. Purposefully. Straight toward the central corridor. The same corridor that had been redirected twice before. But now there was no hesitation in his pace. He had adjusted. Learned. Adapted. The clerk saw it immediately. This was not probing anymore. This was resolution. The intruder raised his hand slightly, not signaling others, but clearing his own path. Behind him, two others began repositioning. Not spreading out. Closing in. Containment formation. The clerk stepped away from the desk. No longer subtle. No longer adjusting around the edges. He moved into the open corridor again. But this time, he did not intercept. He aligned, positioning himself exactly where movement would converge. The intruder stopped a few meters away. For the first time, there was no uncertainty in his posture. Only assessment. The room behind them had gone quiet in a different way now. Not silence from shock. Silence from waiting. The clerk spoke first. Come. Measured. Medical staff will not be involved in your movement. The intruder did not respond. He shifted slightly. Confirming angles. Counting exits. Evaluating resistance. The clerk continued. Your objective is contained within this structure already. A pause. Still no reaction. Then. The intruder took one step forward. That single step changed the entire room. Because it confirmed intent. Not presence. Action. The clerk did not step back. Instead, he turned slightly, not toward the intruder, but toward the ward itself. And spoke again. All non-essential personnel, remain where you are. It was not loud. But it was heard. Because by now, it had meaning beyond voice. The intruder moved again. Faster. The final approach. Behind him, two more entered the corridor. Closing distance. Not rushing. Converging. The clerk raised one hand, not in defense, not in surrender. In direction. The radio on the desk crackled sharply. External units finalizing entry based on internal guidance. Authorizing coordinated breach response. Outside was ready. Inside was about to collide. The clerk stepped forward once, closing the final gap himself. Now there was no space left for interpretation. Only outcome. The intruder stopped at arm's length. The moment stretched. No one moved behind them. No one spoke. Even the ward seemed to wait for permission to continue existing. The clerk looked at him directly. Not fear. Not challenge. Clarity. Then. He pressed the radio transmit button one final time. Engage coordinated containment on my signal, he said. A pause. Then outside. Signal acknowledged. The intruder's head tilted slightly. Understanding shifted, but too late to matter. The clerk lowered the radio. And stepped aside. Not away from conflict, but into structure. The hospital doors at the far end of the corridor burst open as external response units entered in coordinated formation. Everything that had been suspended inside the ward finally moved. Controlled. Precise. Contained. The intruders reacted immediately. But the structure they were operating within no longer matched reality. Positions collapsed into correction. Correction collapsed into containment. And containment became final. The clerk did not watch the takedown. He had already turned away. Because his role was not resolution. It was alignment. He returned slowly to the desk. Sat down. Picked up the pen again. The ward behind him was stabilizing. Systems outside were re-establishing control. People were moving again, but now with instruction instead of uncertainty. A nurse passed the desk cautiously. She looked at him for a long moment. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his answer was simple. "Still staff." No more. The radio clicked once more. Then silence. The system had accepted the outcome. But not yet the source. And that was fine. Because the clerk had never intended to be seen as the cause. Only the correction. The first thing that returned was sound. Not chaos, order trying to reassemble itself. Footsteps in measured intervals. Radios now speaking in complete sentences instead of fragments. Doors opening and closing with authority rather than hesitation. The hospital was being reclaimed. Step by step. At the central ward, patients were moved away from corridors that had been compromised. Staff regrouped into familiar roles, though none of them felt familiar anymore. Everything had shifted too quickly for comfort to return. The clerk remained at his desk. Same position. Same posture. As if nothing inside him had changed. But the room around him no longer ignored him in the same way. People looked, quickly, then away. Then looked again, slower. Not openly acknowledging, but no longer able to fully avoid what they had witnessed. A senior security officer entered the ward with 2 response personnel behind him. Their movement was controlled, professional. But the hesitation at the threshold was not. He surveyed the room once. Then again. "Status report," he said. The nearest nurse answered, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. "Threat contained. Patient stable. 1 minor injury during movement. No fatalities." The officer nodded. Then his gaze shifted. To the clerk. It stayed there longer than appropriate for a routine report. The clerk did not react. He was writing something on a form, standard documentation, clinical, unremarkable. The officer stepped closer. "Who coordinated internal movement during breach?" he asked. Silence followed. Not because no one knew, but because no one agreed on how to describe it. A nurse glanced toward the desk. A doctor did the same. Neither spoke. The officer waited. The clerk finally set his pen down. Slowly. He looked up. "I assisted with routing," he said. A careful phrasing. Not ownership. Not denial. Just function. The officer studied him again. "You issued instructions through unsecured channels," he said. "Yes." "That is not protocol." The clerk nodded once. "I am aware." The answer was not defensive. It was factual. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Because there was no emotional angle to push against. Only result. The officer shifted his stance slightly. "We will need a full debrief," he said. A pause. "Your identity and authorization will be verified." The clerk met his gaze. For the first time since the breach ended, there was something almost imperceptible in his expression. Not tension. Not concern. Evaluation. "I understand," he said. But he did not add anything else. Behind them, the ward continued to stabilize. Equipment was reset. Systems were restored. Communication lines slowly reconnected. But none of it erased what had already happened. A junior nurse approached the desk hesitantly. "Earlier, when you told us to stay put," she said quietly, "you knew exactly what was happening, didn't you?" The clerk didn't answer immediately. He looked at the empty chair beside her. Then back to her. "Yes," he said simply. She hesitated. "And the radio? You were speaking to them?" "Yes." "Who gave you clearance?" A pause. Long enough to matter. No one did, he said. She looked down. Conflicted. Not afraid. Not reassured either. Just unsettled by the absence of a category that made sense. The officer heard the exchange but did not interrupt. Instead, he took a step back, speaking into his radio. Requesting verification on internal coordination anomaly, he said. Subject present, unidentified authority engagement during breach. A pause. Then a response from outside. Unclear at first. Then more structured. The officer listened. His expression changed slightly, not shock, but recalibration. He lowered the radio and looked at the clerk again. But this time, not as a hospital worker, as something unclassified. The clerk had already returned to his paperwork, continuing the task he had been doing before any of this began. Neat. Controlled. Unchanged. Outside the ward, ambulances began to arrive again. Normal operations returning. But inside, nothing had returned to what it was. A senior doctor walked past the desk and paused for a moment. "Are you going to stay on shift?" he asked quietly. The clerk didn't look up. "Yes," he said. A pause. "Then, until end of rotation." The doctor nodded slowly and walked on. The clerk continued writing, as if the world had only briefly interrupted him. And now was learning how to continue again without asking permission. The hospital settled into a version of normal that no one fully trusted yet. Lights returned to their steady hum. Systems reconnected one by one. Conversations resumed, but softer, as if volume itself had become something to reconsider. Nothing was broken anymore. But nothing was the same. At the ward desk, the clerk finished the last entry on a form and placed it into a stack with the others. Neat alignment. Clean edges. No deviation from routine. Around him, staff moved with lingering caution. Not fear now, something closer to awareness. The kind that comes after realizing a structure had been holding them together without their knowledge. A senior officer stood near the entrance of the ward, reviewing final notes on a tablet. He had not left since the containment ended. Every so often, his eyes drifted back to the desk, and then away again, like he was still deciding what to call what he had seen. The clerk checked the clock. End of rotation approaching. He removed his pen from the pocket, placed it on the desk in its designated position, and stood. No ceremony. No acknowledgement. Just completion. A nurse nearby noticed the movement. "You're leaving?" she asked. "Yes," he said. That was all. She hesitated. "For today, or?" He did not answer the rest of the question. Because it wasn't needed. The clerk stepped out from behind the desk. Walked past the chairs. Past the monitors. Past the people who now instinctively gave him space without being told. Not avoidance. Recognition without definition. At the corridor entrance, he paused briefly. Not to look back at the ward, but to check the environment outside it. Habit. Assessment. Then he continued. The officer near the entrance turned slightly as the clerk approached. There was a moment, small, almost imperceptible, where something unspoken passed between them. Not respect. Not suspicion. Something closer to recalibration. "You'll be needed for debrief again," the officer said. The clerk nodded. "I understand." No resistance. No curiosity. Just acceptance of process. The officer hesitated, then added, "We still don't have a classification for what you did in there." The clerk looked at him for a moment. Unchanging. "That's fine," he said. A pause. Then he continued walking. No urgency. No attempt to be seen. Just departure. Behind him, the hospital resumed its controlled rhythm. People returned to their roles. But occasionally, briefly, someone's eyes would drift toward the corridor he had taken, as if checking whether something had changed again without warning. Outside, evening air met him without ceremony. No spotlight. No waiting vehicle. Just distance and silence. He adjusted his sleeves slightly as he walked, blending into the movement of ordinary life outside emergency containment zones. No one followed. No one called out, because nothing about his departure suggested it was important. And that was exactly how it needed to be. Behind him, the hospital doors closed softly. Inside, systems continued stabilizing. Reports were written. Names were recorded. But his name did not sit comfortably in any of them. He crossed the street without pause. No recognition. No attention. Just movement away from structure. And as he disappeared into the slow rhythm of the city beyond the hospital lights, the last thing left behind was not a trace of who he was. Only the quiet fact that, for a short time, everything inside that building had moved exactly where it needed to, because someone unseen had decided it should.